In December 2015, the Trudeau-led Liberal government designated marijuana legalization as a priority during its first speech from the throne. The government is now studying the issue, building coalitions within and outside government, and examining the options for possible implementations. The possible legalization of marijuana for recreational purpose is the subject matter of this first panel. Dr. Lucas Rickert is an instructor in the history department and teaches on the history of medicine and the history of drugs, among other things. Also, Dan Malik, who's an assistant professor at Brock University in health sciences, but also teaches the history of medicine and health policy, has written 2 books related to these themes, including Try to Control Yourself and When Good Drugs Go Bad. Sarah Hoffman is a professor in the philosophy department, and she has research interests in philosophy of mathematics and science, philosophy of sexuality and feminism, and also plans to teach a course on drugs in the near future. And then finally, Sean Tremblath has been writing for the Saskatoon Star Phoenix for 4 years. He covers a wide variety of topics for the paper and contributes many of the cover stories featured in Bridges, which is a weekly magazine published by the Star Phoenix. He has been involved in much of the Star Phoenix's marijuana coverage over the past few years. And so I'll take it away first. Dr. Dan Malik is going to speak for about 8 minutes, and then the others will go. And then please save all questions for a discussion time at the end.
I come at this from someone who studied liquor control and liquor regulation after Prohibition, but I also study drug laws. So I look at kind of the creation of one law and the end of another set of laws. And a lot of what when I listen to the issue of cannabis legalization, I've heard a lot of things that resonated for me. When people characterize cannabis as a negative influence, or they talk about gateway drugs, or they talk about these other social impacts that drugs have on society, I just think about the same sorts of rhetoric from the temperance movement and the prohibition movement 150 years ago, right? And I think it's interesting because alcohol was this incredibly feared, dangerous, and incredibly popular substance. And we ended a period of rapid temperance agitation with Prohibition. And after Prohibition, when that, people say it failed, some people argue it didn't fail, but when it ended, they had to create a new system to deal with this still socially problematic substance. And when I say socially problematic, I don't mean that that it was necessarily causing a lot of trouble, but that people perceived a lot of problems in it. So in all provinces actually, they created a liquor control board of some kind, and some of them have changed in what they do. I approached the topic thinking what I was going to read was, because I was reading these detailed records from hotel regulation and beverage room regulation, and I thought what I was going to read was this sort of temperance-minded group of stern bureaucrats saying, don't drink. Don't drink there, don't drink there, don't drink there. Well, yeah, we'll let you do it, but don't drink. But what I found was that these people saying, well, yeah, we want you to be able to drink, but you just need to kind of do it to alleviate a lot of the problems. Mm-hmm. And the outcome was the sort of a reconstruction of people's relationship with alcohol, and understanding that, yeah, you can drink, you can enjoy yourself, just as the title says, try to control yourself, right? Like, do it in a way that is responsible and respectable. And by doing that, I argued, you are sort of engaging in a form of citizenship, right? You are still being a good citizen drinker. And I use the term citizen drinker. And so I look at that and think, how could that model apply to cannabis legalization? I thought, because even though we see a lot of the numbers about percentage of people who think cannabis should be legalized, and there's a lot of concerns about how it can be legalized, there is still a lot of negative stigma or concerns around cannabis. So one approach I suggest is this liquor control model as a way of redirecting or sort of reframing the way people think about cannabis. And then if history is any predictor, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Over time, as generations become more familiar with cannabis as a legal substance and become see that it wasn't as big a problem as, or if we learn that it wasn't as big a problem as people thought it would be, then rules would be loosened up and restrictions would change, right? So it requires sort of what we call a paradigm shift or a cultural shift in that way. So I don't know if that was 8 minutes, but that's enough. Lucas is like, yeah, that was 8 minutes, Malik. To me, that was like 2 minutes, right? So I'll stop talking now.
The remarks I'm going to be making, which are very, very in favor of legalization, aren't just self-serving, oh, I want to be able to do what I like to do, because I'm not interested in using the substance myself any longer. And in fact, I wish I hadn't used it as much as I did in my life. I'm almost 50 now. I wish I hadn't started so young. I think it's had some negative effects on me. And I think, in fact, there are some real risks involved with cannabis that are often not acknowledged, especially for young people. If I had a child who was a teenager, I would far rather, there are probably a dozen drugs I would prefer that they use before cannabis, none of them legal. And the legal ones, I certainly wouldn't want them using. Alcohol is a poison, so is tobacco. Sorry if I'm treading on anybody's toes, but I'm a living, breathing stereotype in a few ways. I have a very principled stand on cannabis, but actually, just to be upfront about another perhaps contentious thing, I think all drugs should be legalized. Anyway, why do I have that kind of a stand? Well, I'll try not to get diverted onto the other drugs. But the 2 reasons. I think harm reduction. Harm reduction is absolutely central. Human beings want to alter their consciousness. Not just human beings, mammals, possibly even flatworms and ants and other living creatures. It seems to be a drive that is present in animals, including human animals. And it seems relatively inelastic in relation to legal intervention of various kinds. And criminalizing that kind of behavior and the kinds of falsehoods and propaganda that are required to try to trick people into thinking that there are risks that there aren't. Right? And putting those substances into the hands of criminals, people who are willing to make money doing criminal things. They tend to be willing to do other types of criminal things, like violent things and so forth. That just increases harms. So there's a whole bunch of complicated arguments, but they kind of all come down to that. I think that almost any harm that I see, almost any, not any, but almost any harm that I see related to drug use and abuse seems to me to be just made worse by using the criminal justice system.
I think that we may have to move on to Sean now.
Just let me mention one phrase and I'll be done. Freedom of consciousness. I think that adult human beings, should have the freedom to choose their own state of consciousness. And the fact that some people want to get stoned, I don't think it's for the government to tell them they shouldn't.
Thank you.
I suppose I should start with an admission. Up to now, the coverage that me and really the Star Phoenix and most media outlets here have done has focused largely on medical marijuana. That's just because that's sort of an issue that's really happening in our community right now. Now, that said, with the Trudeau government's commitment to legalizing, this is something that we're going to be seeing more and more of. And as that story unfolds, we journalists are going to be a big part of telling that story. I mean, I guess really the story of legal marijuana in Canada is yet to be told. As a topic, it really excites me for a couple of reasons. One of the main things is this is something that kind of touches so many areas of society. I mean, if I think of it in terms of sections in the newspaper, really, we can talk about marijuana, obviously, in the news section. The business section, as it becomes legal and people are selling it, it's very relevant there. The arts and culture section, I mean, there already is a huge marijuana culture, and as it becomes sort of more normalized, watching how that advances is going to be really interesting. And I mean, even in the sports section, there's discussions being had now about whether marijuana should be considered a performance-enhancing drug, particularly in sports like martial arts. So yeah, I'm just excited to see what happens. If you want to see, this is already kind of being done in the U.S. I would recommend anyone interested in the topic check out what the Denver Post has been doing. They've got a website called The Cannabis. I believe it's thecannabis.com or cannabis.com. They've got a marijuana editor at the Denver Post. They've really dived in, and it's a great resource for all of the things I'm talking about. I mean, from a journalistic perspective, there's no sort of special approach to marijuana as far as I'm concerned. I mean, really, right now in Canada, this is a campaign promise that the new federal government made. It's going to shake out in a way that some people are going to like, other people's aren't going to like, other people's, yes. And we will be telling those stories, hopefully, in as balanced a way as we can. And really, a lot of the stories, we don't even know what they're going to be. I mean, using the US as an example again, as I was researching this, I mean, a study was published recently out of Cornell and San Diego State that found that the states that legalized marijuana have had a decrease in obesity rates, which is something you wouldn't, necessarily associate, especially with the stereotype of eating pizza and whatnot. So these type of sort of things we haven't even thought of yet is what we're really going to have to tackle as all this shakes down. And let's get some questions.
So one thing I would ask Sean is, are we seeing in post-media news a different kind of coverage than in other news outlets?
Obviously, sort of old media that I'm a part of has a certain tone that's largely defined by the people that have been doing it through the years. And then when you look at, say, a newer outlet, I guess the one that jumps to mind is, say, Vice. They've got a tone very much defined by the people making it, again. And they, because they were created much more recently, have just a different history and a different sort of tone that they've developed.
So can I push you just a bit more on that? So if you have this new type of media, and a younger generation is consuming this new type of media, how does that influence or shape what the general consensus is around legalization? I mean, I know it's a difficult question, but is it something that you talk about in the newsroom?
When it comes down to it, I mean, we're trying as best we can to find the truth and write about it. I mean, that's sort of the fundamental theory of journalism, right? You become a journalist because you believe the best way to better the world is to present the truth as best as you can find it.
So when we talk about recreational cannabis, one discussion is dispensaries model versus the LP model. I guess one thing I would look at is from previous presentation and other LPs in Canada, they are producers, but they also have a company where they're actually selling. So that company that's selling isn't really a licensed producer. They're more of a dispensary, online dispensary, versus a producer. Your thoughts on that, I guess?
As for predictions, I don't know. I mean, you see examples of both in the U.S. I mean, I guess or maybe not both strictly defined, but, Denver, for instance, has a much more kind of wide open system. We've seen that sort of, that's a very capitalist way to do it, right? And as a result, it's generated a load of money. As for what's best, it's hard to say. Again, it kind of depends how you define that.
You said that you had some negative implications on your life because of using marijuana too young. Do you think if there were laws in place that maybe wouldn't have happened? I mean, like if it was legal and if it was controlled, do you think that maybe that would
even at 14, I think I would have been interested in the science, and I certainly didn't learn any of it, really. Not in school, that's for sure. So I think if we had a context that was genuinely, where society was genuinely committed to harm reduction, which I think involves giving people as much of the truth as we have, and even to the youngins, yeah, I think you can be. And if you're saying, if you've got things like Reefer Madness, that crazy film, we haven't had that kind of stereotype so much recently, but there have been a lot of falsehoods perpetuated. I think there's always going to be problems with drugs in society in terms of people. I mean, drugs solve a lot of problems. Drugs are great, right? That's why they cause so many problems, because they don't keep solving the problems, right? They give people a lot of pleasure. They disengage us from activities that are more meaningful and satisfying in certain kinds of way. They connect us to things that can become problematic. And I think if we talked more openly about those things and talked about why altering our consciousnesses in certain sorts of ways can be a risky thing to do, especially if it's done habitually, right? And then if we talked about those things, I think those harms could be reduced somewhat, yeah.
Just on the issue of law, when the prohibition was lifted on alcohol, there were suddenly all these restrictions put in, and there's been this intensifying of laws dealing with impaired driving. Now, with legalization of cannabis or the normalization of it, I see a potential problem with the whole drug industry, because there are all kinds of pharmaceuticals that people are prescribed every day which impair you far greater than cannabis does, yet people are allowed to drive on them. Are the police going to have to start looking at all impairment when you're dealing with driving?
Well, I'm not a criminologist, so I can't feel too much credibility in speaking, but I've got a microphone, so I'll try. I think if you ask police officer, that when we talk about impaired driving, we talk about not only driving under the influence of alcohol, right? So people can be impaired and not be just having consumed alcohol. So I think that's where that is. Well, the concern with things like cannabis, and this is an issue they were dealing with, and they are dealing or addressing it in Colorado, for example, is does the detection mechanisms, are they effective? Like, and right now they're still working out whether, you know, cannabis, I understand cannabis stays in some people's systems longer than others, even long after they're impaired and things like that. So it's tougher to deal with, right? But I think within the criminal justice system, they're concerned about impaired driving beyond. So if someone is impaired because of a prescription drug they were taking, theoretically they could be busted for that. I don't know if that happens. Like I said, I'm not a criminologist.
There was a study done in 1956 by the Washington State Traffic Board, and they used 2 levels of cannabis, 1 placebo, and an ounce of flat alcohol as a comparison. And they found that the people who got the really good pot were the safest drivers.
Because they were going 20 miles an hour.
I think that's a good example of the type of thing we're going to learn more about, you know, a couple years after this all shakes out again. It's possible that there will be a rash of high driving accidents. You know, we don't know. I suspect that may not be the case, but 5 years after legalization happens, we're going to have a lot better idea of just how big of an issue it is.
I have a question in the back there, sir.
You keep hearing people using alcohol as like a benchmark for what we should be doing with marijuana. But what do you think of like treating it more like a psychoactive substance like coffee, or like more socially accepted than that, and then taking away that air of it that might cause younger people to want to do it? rather than like giving people a choice to develop a taste for it. Like Advil that you can get off the counter, coffee that's like a psychoactive substance that is like widely accepted, and kind of looking into that even more so to deter from glamorizing it in a way.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that Dr. Erica Dick in the history department, the Canada Research Chair, has written about is LSD within Saskatchewan. So maybe there is another example of a drug that is potentially being normalized right now because you're seeing more and more scientific studies in major research institutions. Say it.
There's not enough research on LSD and MDMA and substances like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think the shift you're talking about is largely a cultural one. It's what you spoke about in your opening statements. I mean, the fact is, I don't know if I'm going to be able to convince my grandmother that weed is not as bad as alcohol or worse or whatever. And as generations shift, again, we are assuming this becomes legal and sort of a common thing. People will start to see, both because there's plenty of people who will use it themselves who wouldn't have because it was illegal. People will just start to gain a better understanding of the reality of the substance.
Back there, first of all.
So we were talking about like the 1950s and even earlier in the 1930s regulating drugs and alcohol. But since the 1950s, we have embraced a whole world of drugs. And so a generation has gone by where we hardly have people who haven't taken any drugs, legal or otherwise, particularly pharmaceutical substances. So are we in a new era of drug literacy that will also help to legalize, decriminalize, and differently regulate these drugs than we have seen in the past? If we take the precedents from the past, we're maybe looking at the wrong things.
Which things should we be looking at?
Evidence-based policymaking instead of moral panic-based policymaking. So whether we regulate, a coffee or marijuana or LSD or psilocybin or whatever it might be, it just seems that this new generation has really taken a lot more drugs in our lives already as kids, and we're so used to drugs. We have such a higher literacy, so to speak, in terms of drug taking, and we trust the regulators to make these decisions more so than we ever did in the 1950s or the 30s when some of these things were quite new. So I'm just curious about how that changes the regulatory framework, how we make these decisions. We shouldn't be as bothered by moral panics now. We have so much more information available to us.
Mm. Yeah. Wow, we could talk for a long time, and we may about that.
I think one of the risks that I see in having a system where we have some drugs given the stamp of approval of being legal, right, and others not, is that people presume because something's legal that it's safe. And so in a certain way, I resist your description of drug literate, right? Maybe drug experienced, right? Drug addled even. But not drug literate enough. Although the potential certainly is there.
Yeah, the idea of drug literacy is fascinating, and the fact that we have these columns. Column A is illegal or highly controlled. Column B is prescription. Column C is, buy it at the corner store or wherever you buy them. And it creates this medicalized notion of what is a legitimate use for a substance, right? So the question about coffee could go the other way. At what point does coffee become controlled because it's going to perk kids up a little too much, So
When they're smoking it on Vice.
They do that?
Vice did a story.
What's that like?
It's a bad idea.
Okay.
Don't smoke the
Okay,
coffee.
I won't smoke it. But yeah, so don't smoke your coffee, and don't drink your. No, you can do that. So I mean, that's such a complex question, but it just makes me think about the way we frame legitimate and illegitimate use of something, right? So during Prohibition, the licensing authorities, the alcohol prohibition, licensing authorities spent a lot of time talking to pharmacists and watching pharmacists and how much they were distributing, how much alcohol they were distributing, right? Because the only legitimate use was through medical. So when that ended, there was really no discussion of medical alcohol. It very quickly disappeared.
And let me just say, on one point you made, it's true, there's a lot more information out there, but as someone who spends a lot of time on the internet, both personally and professionally, moral panic is not going anywhere. It is amplified as much as it's ever been.
If we can remove the idea of panic and just have some kind of systematic, rigorous, the first thing that needs to happen is everything has to be legalized, because until you do that, you've got these circles of criminality that surround and sort of affect our understanding of a substance. You know, if the only place you can get it is from some shadowy pusher that is just trying to sell you other stuff because that's the way he markets his product, then you can't ever really get away from those moral panics, right? If you create a system that is, rigorously regulated but legal, then you can start to talk about more of these, maybe get away from those panics. Maybe you never can. I don't know. I mean, you'll always find something to be freaked out about, right?
I think we have to end on the concept of shadowy pusher. Is that it?
Yeah, that's our time. Might you join me in thanking our first panelists? We'll be back in about 3 or 4 minutes with a new set of discussion topics.
There are so many different dimensions to cannabis as currently an illegal substance, the process of legalizing, the issue of medical versus non-medical, that it was a lot of fun and it went really well. And I think we got to exercise some big ideas. And I like being baffled by questions, and there were a few of those, so I really enjoyed that as well.
I'm going to introduce our second panel of the afternoon with a focus on medical marijuana. And first of all, we have once again, as serving as moderator, Lucas Rickert, who now needs no introduction. Second, and presenting first is Murray Updahl. He graduated from the College of Physical Education prior to going into the College of Medicine at the university here. He worked as a family physician for 12 years, but in the last 8 years has been working as a physician with an interest in chronic pain management. Marjorie Delbert is an associate professor of marketing at the Edwards School of Business here. Marjorie's program of research explores the interplay between the persuasive use of language and images and consumer knowledge transfer in the marketing of controversial products, such as prescription drugs. Third, Brent Zettel. He is a pioneer of medical marijuana, CEO of Prairie Plant Systems and CandyMed, a medical marijuana producer outside of Saskatoon. And so I'll give it over to you all as we listen to you.
Well, Lucas gave me permission to use a PowerPoint presentation, and I will really do my best to keep this brief. I'm not here to generate new referrals or to find new patients. My practice is closed, and I don't see people specifically for medical marijuana. My objectives are to discuss why medical cannabis is such a controversial topic for physicians and why many physicians are reluctant to authorize this remedy. In 2014, on April 1st, the new regulations that they call marijuana for medical purposes regulations came into play, and it put physicians in the uncomfortable and unwanted role of the sort of gatekeepers of medical marijuana. And so each physician who decides to authorize their patients can produce this medical document. It's not really a prescription, it's more an authorization then for the person to purchase marijuana for their medical condition. These regulations say the physician can authorize up to 5 grams per day of the dried cannabis. At that time, there was no ruling on oral or edible products. And we can authorize up to a maximum of 12 months, and then these patients need to be reevaluated in a new medical document. At that time, it changed significantly because Health Canada really pulled out of the whole process, and there was no authorization from Health Canada, but rather just the doctors. And so there was no specific medical conditions anymore that kind of qualified like the system before. So it starts right from the top at Health Canada, which is similar to the FDA in the United States, that they're the arm of government that authorizes medications and other substances, saying that they're safe for use and our patients can use them. So if you look in this kind of rectangle, it more or less says that they say dried marijuana is not an approved drug or medicine in Canada. The government of Canada does not endorse the use of marijuana, but the courts have required reasonable access to a legal source of marijuana when authorized by a physician. So this arm of government was trumped by the courts, and they needed to create some regulations to guide physicians in terms of authorizing marijuana for medical use. Now, one of the major sort of associations of physicians in Canada is the Canadian College of Family Physicians. And this is a group that looks after education programs, and almost every family physician in Canada is a member of this association. And they came out very clearly and said Health Canada places family physicians in an unfair, untenable, and to a certain extent unethical position by requiring them to prescribe cannabis in order for patients to obtain it legally. So the Canadian family physician said this really isn't a prescription. This should be more of a declaration or an authorization for patients to purchase marijuana for their medical condition, rather than a prescription that suggests that the physician has recommended the patient use it and suggested a specific dose or directions on how to use it. Now, another big association, which is really all physicians in Canada, including all specialist surgeons, family doctors, is the Canadian Medical Association. It suggests that the Canadian Medical Association recommends caution in terms of use of marijuana for medical purposes. But I think this statement is quite good. While acknowledging the unique requirements of patients suffering with terminal illness or chronic disease for which conventional therapies have not been effective and for whom marijuana may provide relief, physicians remain concerned about the serious lack of clinical research, guidance, and regulatory oversight for marijuana as a treatment. They go on to say how complex of a substance marijuana is, and we don't have sufficient clinical and basic science to provide this as safely as we would with other medications where we have all kinds of studies in terms of safety, drug interactions, benefits, and so forth. So they say there's a need for unbiased, accredited educational modules and decision support tools based on the best available evidence to help physicians. And I'll just tell you a couple of other comments that the Canadian Medical Association is telling to physicians. The Canadian Medical Association has consistently opposed Canada's approach, which places physicians in the role of gatekeeper in authorizing marijuana. Physicians should not feel obligated to authorize marijuana for medical purposes. And physicians who choose to authorize marijuana for their patients must comply with their provincial and territory regulatory colleges' relevant guidelines or policies. So in Canada, physicians have chosen, and we have the privilege of regulating ourselves. So physicians are regulated in terms of their behavior and standards of conduct by other physicians, and they're called College of Physicians and Surgeons. Every province has a different College of Physicians and Surgeons that kind of makes up their own regulations and bylaws. In Saskatchewan, we have a very good document that was created, and it's based on a bylaw from the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Saskatchewan. It more or less says physicians should continue to have a very high standard of medical care. If you are going to authorize someone for medical cannabis, you should be very thorough. You should evaluate that patient's medical condition, their past medical history, past treatments that they've had, whether they were helpful or not, how they tolerated them, and in particular doing an addiction screen to know what the risk of addiction is in that patient, because we do know that some people do develop a cannabis dependency that can really change the quality of their life. So Saskatchewan has guidelines that say we need to keep very good documentation. We need to see our patients on an ongoing basis. There should be a formal doctor-patient relationship. It shouldn't be just a one-time thing to see the doctor and you get your authorization for 12 months and they never see you again. I would highly recommend this article from Dr. Mark Ware from McGill University. It's published in the International Association for the Study of Pain, sort of the world journal in terms of pain, and it's called Medical Cannabis and Pain. And Dr. Ware goes through the whole history going back and in terms of summarizing some of the research that's available. And some of the comments that he made in this particular publication were quite telling. One of the comments was that we're really not going to be able to get large phase 3 trials in human beings with the current environment around marijuana, particularly with the worldview against anti-drug, anti-smoking, and also that there's no sort of availability for high-quality cannabis products to be studied, particularly in the United States when it's still a Category 1 medication or drug that is felt to have no medical purposes. This particular slide just shows that there are studies that have been published that are randomized controlled trials, which is the highest quality of evidence. Majority of studies for cannabis derivatives or cannabinoids are in the nabalone capsule, and they've studied it in neuropathic pain, fibromyalgia, spinal cord injury, diabetic neuropathy. They used to have one called Marinol, which is called dronanabol, but that's been taken off the market in Canada, but it's been studied in multiple sclerosis, spasticity, chronic pain, spinal cord injury. And then the other one on the far side is a spray that's in the mouth called Sativex, and it has probably some of the best evidence in terms of treatment of neuropathic pain, spasticity, and cancer pain. There's really only been 6 really well done RCTs in inhaled cannabis. And these do show a trend for benefit in terms of conditions such as HIV-related neuropathy or other conditions where the nerves have been damaged or are malfunctioning, or in MS or in Crohn's disease. So there is some studies out there, and Dr. Mark Ware in this particular paper says physicians that go with the statement to their patients that, oh, we just don't know enough or there's not enough information, may not be the best thing for that doctor-patient relationship, because there is evidence for some benefit, and it should be a remedy that's discussed along with the more traditional pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical treatments for these really difficult to control conditions. So here's one of Dr. Ware's studies that was really well done with actually a placebo type of marijuana that had 0% THC, and one that had about 5% and one about 10%. And it showed that the stronger cannabis, the stronger THC types of cannabis did provide improvement in these patients' pain. This is a more recent one that was just published in December from Dr. Ware and others that really talked about safety with a very well-controlled, quality-controlled herbal cannabis. When patients who had experience with cannabis used this as part of a monitored treatment program over 1 year, it appeared to have a reasonable safety profile. So no really scary, dangerous adverse effects occurred with it. There was nuisance side effects, which are common with an inhaled substance. And so it suggests safety with this particular agent in medical cannabis users. But he definitely made it clear that longer-term monitoring for functional outcomes, whether the cannabis actually improved people's ability to function, is necessary. Now, the College of Family Physicians of Canada created this 28-page document in terms of giving doctors information on prescribing. And they give 15 recommendations on how to prescribe and how to do it safely. And due to time, I'm not going to go into details about how doctors actually authorize this, but there's a number of steps that the physician needs to do to ensure that the patient understands the risks of potential marijuana, and then we can sign this medical document that can authorize them to use it. But we need to follow up these patients regularly to make sure that they're using it appropriately and there's good benefit. So thanks very much for your attention, and I'll turn this off.
And just so you know that we're being fair here, we did have a discussion that some of the other panelists would cede a couple of minutes. So Marjorie?
Yes, and I absolutely promised Lucas that I would keep it brief and I would donate some of my time to our previous presenter. I have no medical expertise whatsoever, but I have spent an awful lot of time looking at ads for prescription drugs. I don't know if that gives me a little bit. I know a lot about the marketing of legal but controlled substances. And I find this area fascinates me, partly because of the controversy and also just because of that potential for using marketing tools and marketing concepts. I think it's interesting both from, we talked a little bit about the image problem that cannabis has, and I think marketing, a lot of concepts of marketing could be very useful in influencing opinions in either direction, so depending on your stance. But marketing frameworks are also really interesting when we're trying to understand and plan for the potential eventual legalization. And it's really interesting to think about it from a segmentation perspective, which I won't bore you with all the theory behind that, but if you're interested, I think that's essentially what we've done. Even with this panel, we've got recreational cannabis versus medical cannabis, and that's really at a lot of the core of marketing strategy, is developing that segmentation because different user groups have different needs. So I see a lot of application potential for this in terms of understanding just the business side of it, but also understanding opinions, and if we do want to try to influence opinion change, I think we can look to a lot of things from the marketing side. Is that short enough?
Yes, by all means, it's great.
I'll be really short. I think everybody knows what I do, so I don't need to say anything more, right?
That's much shorter than I thought. Well, what that does is it allows us to have questions from the audience. So let's go straight to that then.
Just seeing in the future, how will people's jobs be affected by the use of cannabis, legal or non-legal? Is there going to be laws or policies in place for people who are discriminated for usage? Just a personal story, I know a friend up north, I work in the oil and gas industry. He was in a little incident. He ran over something with his machine. Not a big deal, it was something small. He was tested for drugs and alcohol. Well, he had a medical marijuana card and was fired on the spot. When he asked why he was fired, it was because he had marijuana system.
You know, as an employer, we look at the terms of the medical access for patients. So if there's a true patient that has the appropriate medical documentation and they're truly using it as a medicine, then as an employer, especially within Saskatchewan now, we have to respect that they're going to be allowed to use their medicine when they need to use it under the physician's directive. The challenge becomes is in working with heavy equipment. And there isn't good data that we have that demonstrates when a person who takes and uses and medicates with any kind of narcotic, particularly cannabis in this case, and what's the safe level within the blood that people can operate machinery with. And it probably means that with all of the bugbear around medical cannabis and in the trying to crack down on drugs within the safety aspect for operations because of the lawsuits that hurt from harm of other co-workers, they're going to err on the side of caution until we sort of get better data about what the safe levels are going to be. And I think it's a bit of a prejudice at the moment, but I don't think it's going to stay there forever. But we do need to have enough information as employers to know what the safe level is for people to be able to operate machinery and function in a work environment. We don't know that yet, and I think they're erring on the side of caution at the moment.
I wonder if I can comment too, because as a physician who looks after people with chronic pain, I prescribe a lot of medications that may have an effect on their ability to be safe, whether it's operating a car or heavy equipment. And I'm all about safety because I also look after a lot of people that have been injured in work-related accidents. So I think it comes down to the similar question before about how the police are going to regulate impaired driving. It really comes down to if that individual is impaired at the time that that accident at work happens or that he gets pulled over by the police officer, there needs to be better evaluations of impairment and whether they're safe to operate that machinery. It's not whether that substance is in their body, because as many of you know, there are people who use marijuana on a daily basis and they're not impaired at all, and you cannot tell that they have it in their system. Now, in terms of the workplace, my understanding is some employers have policies that are just completely no drugs, zero drugs. So that will limit people that have a medical authorization to purchase marijuana because they have to use that substance for their treatment. But they may not, if they disclose that to the potential employer, they may not be accepted for that job. But doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be impaired when they have that substance in their body. So this is all going to translate over time in terms of more case law and more evidence, because if medical cannabis is authorized, and especially if now people can grow their own, we need more time and more sort of evaluation of this.
With the College of Physicians for Saskatchewan, they put a restriction on the number of prescriptions a doctor can give without having to report it. Then after so much, they have to report. Now, who came up with this number for the College of Physicians? Was it all the doctors, or was it a group of people who made this restriction to them?
My understanding is when the regulations changed and physicians became the gatekeepers, the College of Physicians and Surgeons just came up with that themselves. It wasn't other doctors, it was the sort of head office of College of Physicians and Surgeons. And my understanding is if a doctor has authorized patients to purchase medical cannabis, if it's less than 20 people, you only have to give that information once a year. If it's more than 20 people, then you're supposed to tell them how many patients and give the medical document about those 20 or more patients. So it's just an arbitrary number because they feel that there's really no way for them to regulate medical cannabis compared to, say, other prescription medications like opioids or whatever, where the pharmacist puts that into a pharmaceutical information program and every doctor and pharmacist can look that up. So the arbitrary number is 20, and you just have to submit that information.
We see a lot of people all the time that talk to us and say that the doctors are telling them that they're not authorized to prescribe it and they're not qualified to prescribe it. Now, is that going to be a big problem in the future, and is that a little bit biased or discriminatory towards people?
I hear your comments, and I think it really comes down to some of the information I presented. A lot of doctors do not feel comfortable with it, and rather than just saying, you know, I'm against it or I don't feel comfortable with it, they might say I'm not authorized, but really every physician in Canada is authorized if they have a license. In my opinion, it would be better to get into a discussion about other treatments and where the cannabis comes in terms of their treatment. But you're right, it creates a lot of difficulty.
Here?
Talking about not knowing the effects of marijuana and the research and whatnot, I know as a nurse when I'm giving a patient literally a handful of pills, I'm pretty sure they haven't been researched, all being given together, you know, with 16 or 18 pills at a time. And I'm wondering, too, like you made the comment that you assess and advise the patient for addiction for cannabis. I'm surprised to hear that. I don't think that's currently being done with opioids, which is, again, as a nurse, I really see a lot of issues that way. But the question is then, if I've understood you correctly, all doctors can prescribe cannabis and are reluctant to. Are they looking to have a system like for methadone where you have to apply to Health Canada for an exemption, where you have the education and is that way more palatable for them and then they wouldn't be authorized unless they had undergone that?
Well, I'll talk on all three of your statements, actually. The idea about interactions with other drugs, from what we understand of the cannabis and the cannabinoid, and there's probably many, many different cannabinoids within cannabis, they're actually not proteins, but more fatty acid type things. So they are less likely to have any specific drug interactions where it will elevate a drug. Like say, for example, methadone, if someone takes an antibiotic like Cipro for a bladder infection, methadone levels go all out of whack. So it doesn't have that type of drug interaction, but if people are on other sedating substances, like you just mentioned, people are on a handful of different drugs, those other sedating drugs might be amplified when people use cannabis. So you have to be careful when you start it in a person who's already on multiple drugs. And I'm sad to hear that you feel that physicians aren't screening for addiction when they prescribe opioids, because it's really highly recommended for everybody. Now, in terms of what the physicians would like the system to be, I'm not aware of any discussion. I really just think physicians don't want to be the sort of the gatekeepers of it. And so I don't think we're looking for a methadone type system where we have to get authorization, because I don't think any doctors would want that authorization.
We've been kind of using marijuana on and off for a long time. I don't know, the doctors seem a little bit scared to give it away, and I don't think they should be as scared. For instance, like other drugs have been researched way more, and they've had caused way, way worse problems.
Potentially, some prescription medications can cause way more problems, but they are at least they're studied in very major long-term trials and lots of people. So I wouldn't say that prescription drugs are safe or haven't caused harm, but You're right, physicians, I wouldn't use the word scared, they're very reluctant to prescribe based on the small amount of information that has been published. And to your point about why it hasn't been studied, like Dr. Mark Ware says, there's no real intellectual property. This is a plant, unless it's kept to the licensed producers that will create a very safe and clean and consistent product. If it's a product that people can just grow, well then doctors are completely out of the loop in terms of knowing what's safe and what's gone into it, or what's pesticides have been put on it, or if it's infected with bacteria or fungus or whatever. So there's a lot of issues.
Marjorie, I wonder, you also have studied the marketing of pharmaceuticals quite extensively. How do you see marketing campaigns rolling out for some of the licensed producers in Canada?
I think it comes down to how it's positioned. So if it's positioned as therapeutic treatment, then we can probably look to other, we have a lot of regulations even for natural health products and how you can advertise those in Canada, and especially for prescription therapeutic products. And in Canada, you're supposed to, they're really only, if you're advertising them direct to consumers, it should be limited just to either price or price, brand name, and quantity. You're not supposed to go beyond that, but we can see in the States, and we get a lot of the media feeds from the States, that they go far beyond that. But the American Medical Association just recently came down with, I guess, a recommendation that we should ban all direct-to-consumer advertising for prescription drugs. So it's a heated debate about a legal controlled substance, and so I can only imagine going forward. I think if we follow the medical marijuana route, and that's how it's positioned, I think we have already some regulations around how we advertise and how we market other products like that. But I think the issues of control will probably be paramount, and how who we allow to be the sources of the message, and then the content. So is it informational or is it persuasion? And that's a huge debate around it. And the research that I have done, I looked at drug ads that were directed to consumers, but also to physicians. And both of them were mostly persuasive in nature, and they contained lots of conceptual metaphors in both of them, also the ones directed to physicians, oddly enough. And so that was really surprising. So I think it's really hard to draw the line between what's informational and what's persuasion, because I believe that most information has to be presented in one way, and you choose one way that you believe is most persuasive to accomplish your communication goal. So I think there are different models that we can look to, but it will be interesting to see how we proceed.
There's been a lot of stuff on the media lately as of LPs have been having what they say is on the label is not what the product test says. So what I'm saying is there's a lack of continuity in this industry right now, and we eat apples every day. We're encouraged to eat apples every day. They use pesticides on apples a lot, and they don't control that or regulate that. And we ingest that the same. So is it kind of, for lack of a better term, apples and oranges kind of thing? Why is there a difference between what you can put into an apple, but all of a sudden once it's marijuana or once it's not grown by an LP, that it's no longer good because what the person's putting in?
I think your apples and oranges is right, because physicians don't have any control over what foods are available or the manufacturing or the growing principles, but we are asked to say whether marijuana is the right choice for our patients. And so there's a whole bunch of other issues in terms of, do they have lung disease? Are they a woman who's potentially going to get pregnant? Do they have a family history or a personal history of schizophrenia or psychosis where, that substance is not a good idea for them? So I think when it comes down to authorizing a substance when it's going to be used for a medical treatment, that's different than just authorizing food.
The reality is that if you look at the system right now, there is, I think, there's been 5 product recalls already from different LPs, and ours hasn't been one of them. But it's because of that standardization question that all the material is supposed to be put into a lot, and it's supposed to be tested for not only cannabinoids, but as we do, we have 281 points of quality control, metals, It has to be tested for microbial loads, et cetera, and it has to meet the certain standards, right? And if it doesn't meet the standards, then it doesn't. Now, in a case of cannabinoids in our system, and we don't speak for all the LPs, but in our system, we follow the British Pharmacopoeia. That's why we have the test results, and it has to fit in with about a 15% confidence interval in terms of its tolerance. And if it doesn't, it's not included in the lot, and that's because it has to match the product label. And in the case of a true drug, if it doesn't match the product label, that's why the recalls happen. And Health Canada is starting to catch the guys that are sort of trying to skate around it. Now, part of the challenge you have with medical cannabis, and why the reason we mill the material and destem it, is because to get a consistent product throughout the volume, you have to have a consistent amount of stuff. And what we found in our tenure when we were working with this stuff, that there's actually quite a large variation in the cannabinoid content from the top of the plant to the bottom of the plant, what we call the immature buds versus the mature buds. And we know that in the development of cannabinoids in the plant, the last 10 days are like where the maximum amount of cannabinoids are being laid down in the oils. So it's kind of like a curve, and in the first part of it, it starts very, very low. And it's we have a 96-day cycle. And in those last 10 days, it can go from, say, a plant that's supposed to mature at 14%, 7 days before, it'll only be half of that. So, but the problem is it ripens from the top to the bottom. We have a very succinct. In the bottom of the plant, those immature buds, as we call them, are about half the strength of the ones that are at the top. So in order to get a very consistent product, you have to be able to, when you blend it, you have to test it to make sure as a lot it's consistent. Now, if you're supplying material in whole bud material, right, the problem is that you can't get away from that variability from within the plant itself or plant to plant. So that's why I think that's part of the reason why they're getting off label. Now, that saying that, the obligation is on the LP to make sure that it is within specifications of the label. That's the law. And so that's why there's been some product recalls. There's been some other reasons, but that's been one of the reasons. So to your point, that's the way they're supposed to do it. And we're being held to that standard to make sure that it is what's inside the bottle is reflected to be in the bottle.
And I'm sorry, folks, but that is the final word. I must say, thank you very much for attending. Thank you.
The audience was really enthusiastic, and we were blown away as organizers about how many people showed up, and then how many people were raising their hands and asking questions and challenging the speakers. And so it could have gone on for more than an afternoon and a half. It could have gone on for days.